In today's episode, we are going to talk about toxic therapy culture.
Couples therapy.
And I'm not advocating that you never go to therapy.
This is Manhattan. Even the shrinks have shrink.
Criticisms that I have about therapy, again, they don't give you advice. All they do is analyze your situation. But if you can pick up a book or talk to a life coach, for example, and put your problems in perspective and learn the art and practice of happiness, I think you'll be much better served than by, going to a therapist for 2 years. You want to be very judicious about how and when you use a therapist. Now, I define happiness as the absence of stress. Therapy is only appropriate if you've been diagnosed with a psychiatric problem, right? If you're just going through a tough time, I think the gist here is that a lot of people are now misusing therapy. Therapists are just so inclined to prescribe drugs to their patients, and I think this is another huge red flag. As a life coach myself or as a happiness consultant, I can't prescribe you any drugs. I think they use a lot of psychobabble and they don't use plain English when it comes to consulting their patients. And again, this is just an intellectual academic exercise. We're not in school. We're not here to write a research paper on why you're having problems. Welcome to another exciting and enlightening episode of the Contemporary Happiness Podcast. I'm your host, David Nima. I'm an attorney by trade and a happiness consultant. The therapy industry and the psychiatric industry has grown tremendously in the last 40 years. And in my opinion, I think there's been a net positive in terms of people being much more in tune with their feelings and, I guess, psychoanalyzing some of the feelings that they might be having. But there was a very fervent discussion on X last week, formerly known as Twitter. Certain people are talking about, the toxic therapy culture and how therapy is actually kind of a bad thing for society, or I guess the normalization of therapy. Or I think the gist here is that a lot of people are now misusing therapy. So let's break that down a little bit, and then I'm going to give you some tips on how you can best use therapy and ultimately how you can be happy, right? Now, I think the goal of therapy is to increase your happiness. You usually go to therapy because of some traumatic event that's happening in your life or has happened in your life that has led to you feeling bad, right? And feeling anxiety, feeling depressed, and a variety of other conditions that are diagnosed by therapists. But ultimately, it is that you want to be more happy in your life. Now, I define happiness as the absence of stress. And it totally makes sense that if you've been through some type of traumatic event, whether recently or during your childhood, that you are feeling more stress in your daily life. And I think it's important to undo this stress, to unwind the stress, and essentially practice more happiness. I'm all for that. The question is, are modern day therapists the best people to help you achieve more happiness? And in my opinion, I think that the therapy industry has really gotten out of hand. A few criticisms that I have with the therapy industry are as follows. Here's a tweet by Matt Walsh. And he says that the normalization of therapy is becoming a bad thing for society. I'm seeing more and more people use the fact that they're in therapy as a get out of jail free card for awful behavior. They believe that everything their therapist says is gospel truth with no further research or analysis required. And they equate the act of going therapy with the actions of quote unquote being a good person. I'm not saying therapy is bad for everyone, but I'm seeing a trend of less personal responsibility for bad behavior and a lot more talk about therapy as the only solution. Now, I think this is a valid hot take. I think that there's a lot of people that I've experienced in my own consulting and in my own life, and as well as seeing it in the world. A lot of people are misusing therapy. They're relying on therapy as a crutch or otherwise as an excuse or a substitute for bad behavior, for, let's just say, non-optimal best practices if you want to be happy. And essentially, they don't know how to be happy, and they think that going to therapy is going to resolve all their problems, or it's going to make them happier. But that's often not the case. I think what's been interesting to me is when I see people that are not educated in therapy or psychology that are throwing out buzzwords. Psychobabble essentially is what I call it. And kind of self-diagnosing or diagnosing others. I think this all started with the ADHD movement over the last decade. And I think there was a very interesting comment on Twitter that said that, my friend's daughter, who's 8 years old, is talking about having anxiety. 8-year-olds don't have anxiety, right? They might be feeling nervous or they might feel bad for a day or something, but having anxiety is a diagnosed condition, right? And that's the whole point here, that most therapy is only appropriate if you've been diagnosed with a psychiatric problem. Right? If you're just going through a tough time, therapy may not be the solution for you. Now, of course, now you're thinking to yourself, hey, what's wrong with just going to therapy, in addition to other things that I might be doing? Well, like I said, I think the people falsely rely on therapy as a substitute or in the place of, best practices for happiness. Obviously, in my book, Good Problems to Have, The Anatomy of Contemporary Happiness, I dive deep into the anatomy of happiness and what you need to do to practice happiness, which is things like having a tremendous amount of gratitude, having the proper perspective on your problems, not judging other people, having a good diet, which certainly leads or impacts your emotional state, and also the physiology of happiness through sleep, smiling, sex, and sweating. The physiology of happiness. You got to optimize all of these things if you want to be happy. And people, in lieu of that, kind of go to therapy and they think that they're on the path to happiness, but they're really not. So that's the real kind of criticism here in terms of the modern day toxic therapy culture. The problem with therapists, there's a few problems with therapists that I think you want to watch out for if you're considering therapy or if you're in therapy. Number one, therapists rarely tell you what to do. They don't kind of give you advice. All they do, in my experience, is they analyze your situation. They analyze it and they might hypothesize about the root cause of your situation, right? And then they attach theories to these or buzzwords like, you weren't loved enough as a child, for example. Your inner child is suffering from something. You have a mental block, for example. These are buzzwords. You're facing a negative emotion. Well, what kind of negative emotion? Is it fear? Is it sadness? Are you tired, for example? So therapists just kind of, like I said, they analyze your situation to the best they can based on their training, which is usually exclusively in the field of psychology. And they kind of provide you advice. They don't really provide you with advice that you can use on a daily basis, right? Things, for example, like, your mother didn't love you enough as a child, or you weren't hugged as a child. How's this going to help you in today, now that you're an adult? It's not going to necessarily help you by knowing the cause of your issues. Now, sometimes knowing the cause of your issues can be helpful, but not always. And the whole point of this podcast is to make you kind of rethink therapy and making sure that you're correctly using therapy. Again, I'm not against therapy. I think mental health awareness is a positive. There's been a net positive with the increase in therapy culture over the last 50 years. But that's not to say that there's negative ramifications or there's no negative ramifications from the modern therapy culture. And I think, again, you want to be careful that you are correctly using therapy in your life. So going back to the kind of the criticisms that I have about therapy, again, they don't give you advice. All they do is analyze your situation. The second criticism I have is that they're usually giving you advice through a very myopic point of view. And what I mean by that is that they are just narrowly focused on psychoanalysis, which is the study of the mind. But they're rarely experts when it comes to diet, for example. They're rarely kind of giving you advice in the realm of physicality and exercise, right? They might tell you to go work out a little bit because everybody knows that exercise does produce endorphins. They're not really kind of guiding you the way that you probably need to be guided towards optimizing your diet, towards optimizing your exercise, and also optimizing your mindset. Right? And they talk in, again, these very esoteric terms instead of plain English, like using words like happiness, love, stress. I think, again, this single discipline focus of therapists is another valid criticism of therapists. Third, they are bound by their professional rules, right? And I think they have they're in handcuffs, so to speak, in terms of what they can and cannot say to you because they're a professional. They're licensed by a professional licensing board. And if they run afoul of the industry in any way, they have a risk of losing their license. Me, for example, as an attorney, I can give you life advice, right? I can coach you personally. I can tell you anything that I want to tell you within that consultation. And there's no risk of me losing any kind of license or credential because of the advice that I'm giving you, because I'm not bound by the professional rules of conduct that govern therapists. Now, I am an attorney, and I am bound by the professional rules of conduct from the California State Bar. But as long as in the consultation, I tell you that this is not, therapeutic consultation, and I position the consultation as life coaching advice, I can tell you anything I want during that consultation without any kind of ramifications from a governing body. But therapists can't do that. Your average therapist is licensed by their, state licensing board, and they have a risk of losing that license if they don't comply with certain rules and parameters that I think it may actually be a hindrance to their proper consultation to you. In addition, therapists are just so inclined to prescribe drugs to their patients. And I think this is another huge red flag. As a life coach myself or as a happiness consultant, I can't prescribe you any drugs, right? No prescription drugs. And I think just kind of automatically prescribing drugs to their patients or just being so quick to prescribe drugs, I think has been a tremendous negative when it comes to the modern counseling culture. In addition, therapists, are a business. They're in a business here, and their business is to have repeat clients, right? If they tell you something on the first session that heals you, right? Which never happens when it comes to therapy, that you're going to be healed in one session, then they're going to be out of business, right? So they're not necessarily, like I said, in the business of solving your problems or making you happier. They're in the business of having you keeping you coming back to their office. And this is another huge problem. In my consultations for life coaching, I have a cap at 3 hours with an additional extension for another 3 hours. We're talking 6 hours, 6 sessions. That's it, right? To kind of bring you up to speed when it comes to happiness best practices. This is not going to be, if you consult with me, we're not going to be seeing each other for every week for 6 months. It's not going to happen that way, right? Because the things that I need to tell you and to consult you on happiness, which are all in the book, by the way, you can just read the book. And if you actually practice the things in the book, I guarantee you'll be happier. But if you want my one-on-one consulting, I'm happy to consult you using the book as a guide. But again, we're not here for a 6-month engagement or a 2-year engagement where we're going to be seeing each other every week and talking about, what happened to you that week and stuff like that. That's not the business that I'm in, at least, right? As a non-therapist. So, they have this revolving door business model, which can be a hindrance to your personal happiness. And, finally, like I said, I think they use a lot of psychobabble, and they don't use plain English when it comes to consulting their patients. And again, this is just an intellectual academic exercise. We're not in school. We're not here to write a research paper on why you're having problems in your marriage, right? It's very clear why you might be having problems in your marriage. Right. You may have gotten into the marriage under false pretenses, right? Or you didn't know yourself as well as you should have, or you were in denial about something. And now you're in this marriage, for example. Again, so they don't talk in these kind of plain English terms like self-love, self-acceptance, self-awareness, right? They don't say those words. They talk in these kind of esoteric, academic buzzwords that I think, again, is a big hindrance to therapy culture. So bottom line here is that you want to be very judicious about how and when you use a therapist and why you're using a therapist, right? And if you've had some kind of severely traumatic experience and you need to talk to somebody about that, right? Let's say you're coming back from battle in a war somewhere, right? Or let's say that you've been a victim of a violent crime recently or maybe sometime in the past. These are things that I think that you should talk to your therapist about just so that you can unwind a little bit. But at the end of the day, even my book will address those problems, right? It will address those problems of how you need to think about your past. Right? What are best practices for how to think about your past and how to leverage your prior experience for a happier you right now, right? And you don't need a therapist for that. All you need is a change of perspective. And that change of perspective rarely comes from therapy. Again, therapy is just purely designed to psychoanalyze your issues, which is a useless exercise in your everyday life. But if you can pick up a book or talk to a life coach, for example, and put your problems in perspective and learn the art and practice of happiness, right? The art and science of happiness, then I think you'll be much better served than by, going to a therapist for 2 years and having little to show for it at the end of 2 years. So that's my hot take on the toxic therapy culture. If you're having any kind of mental issues or problems and you're watching this video, feel free to contact me. You can contact me through the comments or through Twitter or however way that you can get in touch with me and tell me about your problems, and I'll do my best to help you with your problems. Again, I'm not advocating that you never go to therapy, but you have to be careful about how you're using therapists in your life. This is David Nima, happiness consultant and lawyer, host of the podcast, Contemporary Happiness. Make sure to like and subscribe to the Contemporary Happiness podcast on YouTube, and I will see you all in the next episode.